Digital and Tech Transformation Advisor at the Tony Blair Institute of Global Change, where she leads digital and technology work streams in Ethiopia in support of implementing Digital Ethiopia 2025 strategy. Before joining Tony Blair Institute, Ms. Jack served as coordinator of projects at Smart Botswana, Office of the President, where she managed the implementation of Botswana's digital transformation strategy, Smart Bots, across the public sector. Previously, she was the manager of broadband policy and regulation at the Botswana Communications Regulatory Authority, overseeing the implementation of the national broadband strategy and providing policy and regulatory guidance on emerging technologies. Additionally, she worked as research for the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology Global Commercialization Center, where she facilitated technology transfer and commercialization projects between Botswana and South Korea. With extensive expertise in policy and regulation, Ms. Jack has significantly contributed to Botswana's digital economy through initiatives like the Smart Botswana Strategy, National Broadband Strategy, and Universal Access and Service Fund projects. Her recent work in Ethiopia includes overseeing the development of the National E-Commerce Strategy, evaluating and prioritizing e-government services, advancing data governance, and scaling digital ID enrollments. Passionate about internet governance, Ms. Jack advocates for bridging the digital divide and connecting underserved and unserved communities. She is also committed to fostering youth participation in technology policy, aiming to empower the next generation to shape an inclusive digital future. So please applaud her, come to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are we feeling after lunch? Are we all alert, or we need a little nap or coffee? Okay. Thanks for joining this session. I hope you find it very useful, thoughtful, and helpful in your everyday work. So, like Dr. Asrat mentioned, I work for the Tony Blair Institute. For those who don't know the Tony Blair Institute, we're a global, not-for-profit organization. We support governments and leaders globally on strategy, policy, and delivery. Also increasingly looking at the role of tech across all three, because we believe is what can help to solve the problems that we have globally. We operate in more than 45 countries globally, with a strong presence in Africa, but we're also in Asia, in the Americas, the Middle East. So if you look for services or you want to partner with the Tony Blair Institute, you can find us almost everywhere across the globe. Okay, in terms of the session today, I have 3 panelists. All of them will be joining me online, just prove that technology can bring people together from anywhere across the world. So we need connectivity to touch every part of the world, to touch everyone, and to be resilient so that we are connected even if we are not together physically. So the purpose of this session, which is around bringing Africa's connectivity to the next level, is to explore the current state of connectivity in Africa, examine and new and emerging technologies that can be used to bridge the connectivity divide and identify data-driven approaches to enhance and measure Africa's internet connectivity and performance. Last year, I moderated a session on connecting the unconnected at the pre-IDC. And before I started the session, I shared some quick facts around the status of connectivity in Africa. So one that in terms of global connectivity, recent reports indicate that approximately 2.6 billion people remain offline. And then moving into Africa, we have around 860 million people who are still offline. So you'd see that the majority is in Africa. Then from there, when we move into East Africa, which covers the IGAD countries that we has brought us together today, we have around 360 million people who are unconnected. That's close to 50% of the population that remain offline across Africa, which shows us that we still have a long way to go, a lot of work to do to make sure that the people in this region are connected. And it's a good thing that we're having this conversation today to see how do we actually bring Africa's connectivity to the next level and bring the majority of the people online. So today I'll be joined by three panelists. The first one will be Mr. Steve Song. Maybe I'll briefly introduce him before I move to the other panelists. So Steve Song is the Senior Director, Infrastructure and Mapping and Development at the Internet Society. He has recently worked as a consultant on access regulation and policy at the Association for Progressive Communications. He also a policy advisor with the Mozilla Corporation previously, and a research partner with the Network Startup Resource Center. He has a blog that is called manypossibilities.net that everyone should visit, which is a popular destination for anyone who is working on African telecommunications and internet issues. Please do visit that website to see the kind of work that he does to show the status of connectivity across the continent. He has also been actively maintaining public maps of undersea and terrestrial fiber optic infrastructure in Africa. He's also the founder of Village Telco, a social entrepreneur that manufactured low-cost Wi-Fi mesh voice over IP technologies to deliver affordable voice and internet service in underserved areas. Previously, he worked at the International Development Research Center, where he led the organization's ICTs for Development program in Africa, funding research into transformational potential of ICT. So that's the first presenter for our session today. The second presenter will be Mr. Dan York, who is a senior advisor at the Internet Society, where he has led the organization's analysis of LEO satellite systems, seeking to understand the benefits and challenges of this new way to provide internet access to connect the unconnected. Dan has been with the Internet Society since 2011 and has evolved and had roles evolving DNS security, IPv6 communication, supporting local technical committees and more. Prior to joining the Internet Society, Dan spent 10 years in the voice over IP industry, and prior to that, 10 years in IT training. Having been online since the 1980s and authored 6 technical books, he is a strong advocate for an open internet. He lives in the US, near Vermont. All right. The last speaker who will join us today will be Mr. David Belson. He's the head of insights at Cloudflare, who manages Cloudflare Radar and the Cloudflare blog. He has nearly 30 years of experience in internet infrastructure and has worked with content delivery networks, cloud platforms, and web hosting providers. For the past 15 years, David has specialized in thought leadership and media coverage based on internet measurement, monitoring with a particular focus on internet disruptions. Looking at the profiles of our speakers today, you see this is a continuation of the conversations that we had this morning, where others touched on internet resilience across Africa and what we need to do to make sure that we have more resilient internet infrastructure. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Mr. Steve Song to the stage virtually to talk to us about the region's networks. He will have 20 minutes to give us a presentation before we need to move to the next speaker. Please give him a round of applause so he hears you online. A big one, please. Welcome, Mr. Steve Song. Hope you can hear me.
I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me? Can you hear me there? Can you check? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Please go ahead. You can share your screen. Oh, yeah, I see it.
Okay, thank you for the very kind introduction and the privilege of being able to speak to you today. The issue of network resilience is something near and dear to my heart, so I'm very glad that has been a theme of conversation today, and it's exactly what I want to talk about today when talking about the Open Fiber Data Standard. So I think it's important to recognize just how far things have come in a very short time. So if we turn the clock back 15 years or 16 years now, we can see that that was just the beginning of high-speed broadband access. On the East Coast, the Easy cable, the CCOM cable, the Teams cable had just been launched in that year. And prior to that, satellite connectivity dominated access, which was very expensive and largely unaffordable to most. And we fast forward to 2025 now, and seems almost miraculous, the number of undersea cables, the capacity that is now reaching the shores of African countries. It is a huge transformation. And it hasn't stopped at the shores, and if you want to find out more information about these undersea cables reaching every country around the world, that information exists. Companies like Telegeography maintain excellent maps of undersea cable infrastructure, and there's a lot of information available. And it's an extremely important technology as well, because it's different from all other access technologies by virtue of its huge capacity. A single undersea cable like Equiano or to Africa can carry more capacity than an entire, LEO satellite constellation. It is truly the deep water ports of the internet. And of course, that capacity hasn't stopped at the shores. There has been massive investment in terrestrial fiber optic infrastructure, and this map, for instance, you can see most of this infrastructure has emerged in the intervening 15 years. Since the arrival of those undersea cables. However, finding out information about terrestrial fiber is much, much harder than it is to find out information about undersea cables. You get some operators, and I'll just give a few examples here, that publish very detailed maps of their fiber infrastructure, right down to the curbside. So this is a fiber operator in the United States called Unity, and you can go online to that link at the bottom of the screen there and zoom down to any part of their network and see the full extent of infrastructure, ranging from the availability of dark fiber to lease capacity, etc. Similar things you can see in Canada. This is on the extreme west coast of Canada, a network that's built out on Vancouver Island. And not only can you see the map online, but you can actually download it. You can download it as a KMZ file, which opens up in Google Earth or Google Maps, and you can integrate that data with other data resources. And that's a key point that I want to come to in more detail as we go on. In South Africa, one of the largest fiber operators in South Africa, Dark Fiber Africa, have published since their very first network launch, which was, I think, back around 2010, detailed maps of their fiber infrastructure, which have been available online all this time. And I want to give one more example that I like to bring up simply because I think it addresses concerns that are sometimes expressed about cybersecurity and the publication of network maps. This is one of the largest fiber operators in the Ukraine, and they have maintained an online map for years, and even through the current conflict, and incredibly detailed maps too. If there's a little zoom in bubble there where you can see that their infrastructure maps go right down to the curbside. So obviously network security and resilience is a key issue in the current conflict, but having online maps doesn't seem to make a difference one way or another in terms of affecting the network security. And of course, there are many valiant initiatives to map network infrastructure. The ITU transmission map is an attempt by the ITU to build a comprehensive picture of terrestrial fiber optic networks, but it's hamstrung by the fact that the operators that share their data with the ITU do so under an NDA, which doesn't allow the ITU to make the network information downloadable, or for additional meta information to be visible. So while the map is an excellent resource, the nature of the way that operators share with the ITU limits the utility of this map. So for instance, you can't download this data and integrate it into an existing GIS system, or combine the data, or compare it, or look at historical analysis, or anything like that. So it's excellent, but unfortunately limited. So this is a topic that has been near and dear to my heart for many years. I've been attempting to map terrestrial fiber networks across the continent since about 2012, and I went about it thinking that it would be possible to gather this information by crowdsourcing it and simply looking for online maps, or writing to operators, or looking at World Bank studies. And it was successful to some degree. It's about 70% accurate, I would say. But unfortunately, it's just some operators don't wish to share their data, or it's not available in an accessible format. And so I realized that there was a limit to what one could do simply by kind of looking for public sources of information about fiber networks. However, it did have one significant impact that changed the way I think about mapping networks. And that was a pair of researchers from Sweden who asked for access to the underlying data for this map, the After Fiber map. And you can get it just by clicking on the About link. And by having access to that data and downloading it, they were able to combine the fiber optic network map data with employment data, and establish that there was a significant correlation between employment levels and proximity to fiber optic infrastructure. And that I think really drove home for me just how powerful it is to be able to have access to network infrastructure data, to be able to combine it with other kinds of socioeconomic data to better understand the impact of investments in this kind of infrastructure. And that also attracted the attention of the World Bank, who realized that they were spending, they invest, millions and millions of dollars in network infrastructure, and they are interested in understanding the impact of those investments. And so this led to a consortium of organizations interested in pursuing transparency and looking at how we could unlock more information about fiber optic network infrastructure in a way that is safe and reusable, and that can be shared by all. And it was a partnership that was funded by the World Bank, but led by the World Bank and the ITU, but with the Internet Society, the Mozilla Corporation, Liquid, one of the largest fiber operators on the continent, C Squared, a metro fiber operator in Kampala and Accra and Monrovia, and Digital Council Africa, which is an association of fiber to the home operators across the continent. And that partnership led to the development of a standard, a way of describing, a standardized way of describing terrestrial fiber optic networks. And we were, thanks to the support from the World Bank, we were able to contract one of the global experts in open data initiatives. So the Open Data Services Group in the UK lent their expertise to this project. They've worked on other initiatives such as the Open Contracting Data Standard or the International Aid Transparency Standard or Beneficial Company Ownership Standards. We were able to not reinvent the wheel when it came to setting up open data standards and benefit from their expertise in developing it. And to be clear, the benefits are available to everyone. Everyone, if there is more transparency, a more standardized way of sharing information about terrestrial networks, everybody benefits. So governments and regulators benefit from having more accurate information by facilitating coordination across different sectors. So when gas lines or rail lines or other kinds of infrastructure are built, being able to understand the ability to leverage other investments and not disturb existing investments. So reducing the physical interruption and destruction of networks through more transparency. And of course, the ability to actually benchmark. Now, with a common standard for describing infrastructure, it's possible then to be able to compare effectively in the regions and in countries and in subregions. But maybe, and I think this may be the most important slide of my presentation, the biggest benefit to government and regulators is to understand the true extent of national fiber infrastructure. So to illustrate this, this is a map of fiber networks in Brazil. And on the left-hand side, you can see that's Sao Paulo, and on the right-hand side, Rio de Janeiro. And those are the two largest cities in Brazil. And it looks like there are about 9 networks connecting those two cities because 9 network operators have reported that they have fiber links between those two cities. But as a regulator, it's very hard to know whether that is fiber that is owned that has been physically built by the operator. Is it dark fiber that's been leased from another operator? Or is it lit capacity? Because all of those are valid answers to the question of, do you have a fiber route between these two cities? But in terms of resilience, knowing whether you have 9 fiber networks or 3 or 2 or 4 networks is absolutely critical to understanding the resiliency of the network routes between these two major centers. And the only way that you can do that is by having a standardized way of describing fiber optic networks. Without that, you get this. It just looks like 9 networks, but in fact, the number is smaller. And so this is key to understanding, the network failures, right? If we want to understand how resilient a network is, we need to know more about the physical nature of those networks. And operators benefit as well. So having more public information about network infrastructure levels the playing field for smaller operators because the largest operators, there are information asymmetries, right? And larger operators have more access to information than the smaller operators or new investors. Learning about where the opportunities are for investment, more transparency is only going to open up the potential for more investment and more entrepreneurship. And also, operators don't trust each other. right? And this is, I think, normal. But if there were, and so reluctant to share information because nobody wants to share more information than their competitor. But having a common standard for information sharing means that everyone can raise the trust level a little bit by knowing that they will be sharing the same amount of data. And of course, having a standard means that you can then use that data to demonstrate the impact of your investments. And a standardized network description means you can have better tools for manipulating that data. And to illustrate the power of data standards in this kind of environment, I want to point at a different standard and just show you how the impact of this standard behind the scenes. So if you've ever been to a big city like London or New York and wanted to use public transport, if you go to Google Maps, you could find out where all the metro links are. You could find out bus times. It's all available online. And the way that has been enabled is by transit authorities and Google and Bing and Apple Maps collaborating together to create a standardized way of describing routes, trips, bus stops, locations. And by creating an open data standard, which is called the General Transit Feed Specification, everybody benefited. The operators of the bus routes and the underground operators benefited. The clients benefited by having access to the information, and the map providers benefited by being able to offer a richer resource. So the power of an open data standard in a particular context like this cannot be overstated. And just to give you a sense of what it is, I mean, the standard describes the network. It describes the individual routes on the network, the points of presence, the operators, the physical infrastructure. It may describe the network funders. That's optional. Or the contracting that's gone involved. The standard can be filled out to the degree that operators are comfortable. And it consists of three different things: of a schema, which is kind of like a database that describes the different fields that exist, meticulous documentation of all the fields so people understand how to use the data schema, and then tools for manipulating and storing and validating that data. At the moment, it is very focused on location data, so where the points of presence are, where the fiber routes are, the technical details of those fiber routes, so the ITU standards to which the fiber conforms to, and administrative data as to, for instance, who owns the networks. It's focused on national and middle mile infrastructure at the moment, but the intent is also to encompass last mile infrastructure in the future. We've been working with regulators in Kenya and Ghana and the Operator Association to socialize the standard. ISOC has now announced its commitment this year to supporting the growth of the standard. The World Bank, through the Communications Authority in Kenya, is funding a regional initiative to provide support to regulators and operators to adopt the standard. So this is the year really to get involved. A lot of work has gone into the development of the standard. I encourage you to look at the presentation, which will be shared. There are many links in it, as well as these links for further reading. And please get in touch, because we would be very interested to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. You nailed that in less than 20 minutes. I really appreciate that. Okay, give him another round of applause, please. That was definitely a very informative presentation, and thanks for sharing useful resources on where one could understand the status of connectivity globally, from resources such as the ITU, the telegeography, and the different maps that have been developed by different countries. And also what I also found really important to stress is the importance of availing data on infrastructure mapping to help with understanding the level of connectivity that we have across our countries, to help with planning and understanding the gaps that are there, such that we have targeted investments to close the gaps on connectivity. So Steve, just before you go, I just wanted to have one quick question before I call the next speaker. So in terms of Africa, how would you say, how open are African governments and regulators to using the open fiber standard that is now available? Are there any challenges that have been encountered in the process? Over to you.
Thank you. There have been, in general, regulators have been very, very positive about the open fiber data standard. I think the biggest challenge lies with the operators themselves. I mean, you know, it would be an option for regulators to compel operators to provide information using the open fiber data standard. But from a regulatory perspective, you know, carrots are always better than sticks. And so our goal is to create a level of trust with operators that they feel comfortable owning and sharing their own data in a way that where they see that sharing that data is a tide that raises all ships in terms of everyone having access to better information. And, you know, in general, the reaction from operators, especially, you know, operators like Liquid Intelligent Technologies, has been positive, but nobody wants to be first. So we are in a kind of chicken and egg scenario here, where it's a question of building trust through demonstration and having operators publish their data, you know, and not comprehensively, but a minimum kind of viable data set about their networks that will signal to other operators that, you know, this is something that is going to. It's just going to be better for the market in general in every country, and also regionally in terms of understanding cross-border connectivity, network resilience, and recovery.
Thank you very much again, Steve, for that. If there are any questions from the audience, please keep them. We'll have a chance to ask questions later. For now, I'm going to invite our next speaker, Mr. Dan York, to present on satellites filling the connectivity gap. Over to you, Dan, and welcome. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here to talk to you all. I was looking at your temperature, and right now, where I live in the northern United States, it's minus 17 C. So I would gladly be where you are, a little bit warmer there. So I wanted to talk a bit about satellites and satellite connectivity as it relates to what we're to how we bring connectivity to more places in the world and more parts of things and what we're doing. And in answering this question really of can connectivity, can satellites fill the connectivity gap in different forms? So in this first part of what I want to talk about today, I want to look at kind of give a little bit of an overview and make sure we all are talking the same language and understanding the differences and pieces around that. We've been looking at satellite connectivity from low Earth orbit satellites, or LEOs, for a good period of time. And we've seen how much it can change lives. This is an example up in the Arctic, in the northern part of Canada, where a small village, a small community created a community network that used Starlink as a connection back to the rest of the internet. And they were able to go and create a sustainable, network that works among people there, that provides internet connectivity, that's connected back to the rest of the world via this kind of low Earth orbit satellite. On your tune of resilience, I was thrilled to hear that was the morning session. It was a little too early for me to tune in, but satellites and low Earth orbit satellites have become a game changer in disaster response, in providing additional paths of resiliency. This is a shot from a scene here in the United States for a hurricane that hit us in late 2024, where a lot of the restoration of connectivity happened, at least initially, to get some through bringing in, this is a group called ITDRC that brings in trailers that have cell phone connectivity that then use satellite, use LEO's-based satellite to go and get connectivity into that trailer and be able to to bring it out to folks everywhere they are. There was also a similar technique happening with OneWeb, which is another constellation out of Eutelsat, which is based in the European Union. But again, providing connectivity in times of disaster in this case, but also just providing, resilience in some form. The connectivity can truly be life-changing. And this cloud that we're looking at is looking like this. This is a map from not too long ago that shows a representation of all the different satellites that are circling the Earth at this moment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Just to kind of step back, if we look at the orbits that are out there, that how we talk about satellite connectivity, we have, as you can see on the left side of the screen, we have low Earth orbit, which is generally referred to as things under 2,000 kilometers from the surface of the Earth. Then way out at the farther end, you have geostationary or geosynchronous orbit, which is around 36,000 kilometers, and that is the where traditional satellites have been. That's the kind of space that we have there. And the interesting aspect about putting something out at geostationary is that they can be parked over a specific spot in the Earth. And so this is how we've had many of the traditional satellites. You launch one satellite up there, is parked over a space, and then it can work and be able to, has a wide beam, like a wide flashlight it hits most of the Earth. With 3 geosynchronous satellites, you can pretty much get global coverage. Or, as has happened in many parts of Africa, a country can go and launch a satellite and have it parked over its country and be able to get connectivity into its region. The challenge is it's just super slow because you wind up having to go all the way out to that satellite and back. So, but you have this kind of space that people are deploying in different areas. And in between this is the medium Earth orbit. So you'll have some constellations, as they're called, constellations of satellites that will have out in middle Earth orbit. You'll have things like SES has what used to be the O3b network, which is about 20 satellites. Then as you get closer to the Earth at around 1,200, OneWeb has about 600 satellites. When you get closer and you're down at about 500 kilometers like Starlink is, you need at least about 3,000 or so to get good global coverage in some form. And you keep going lower, the more you need in some form, in some way. This is what's happening. An important part to think about with regard to how LEOs work is that there's 3 different components, all of which have technical and regulatory policy aspects. One is the constellation. It's the hundreds or thousands of satellites that are there. And in the terminology, they talk about things at different shells and different, if you think about it as a shell around the Earth in some form, different altitudes, different levels around that. Then there's the thing you use on the ground. In the days of geostationary satellites, we just called it a satellite dish, right? Because you could put it on the side of your building, you point it at the satellite, the geostationary satellite in the sky, and that's it. You pointed it there because the satellite was always in the same spot, and that's how you got your connectivity. That's how you got your video, your TV, whatever it might have been. That's the piece that was there. But today, with satellites moving all the time, there's no way that you could just point a dish at a satellite. They're always moving. But today these satellites are not, they're not a dish. They're look more like a box that you might have pizza in or something. The antennas are phased array. They're electronically steerable. They don't move like the old dishes might have in some ways. Typically, they also come with a router. It's something like that if you've seen a Starlink kit. In satellite terminology, these are called user terminals. Starlink, in the terminology, I've heard some people just call them Starlinks or Starlink kits or dishes or other different kinds of things around that. And then you have the third component is the ground stations, which are often called, gateways, landing stations. There's other terminology and other ways to do it. A typical picture looks like this, right? Your user terminal, your dish is connecting up to a satellite, coming down to a ground station where it connects out to the internet. Of course, with these satellites moving so much, you're really probably your connection is going from one to another because a satellite in low Earth orbit in a Starlink orbit will typically go across the sky in about 5 minutes. And so you're always acquiring more satellites, moving it. And that's really the fascinating part of what's happened with the latest round of technology is that these things have evolved to where you can do this and work really well. Another evolution that's happened because there was a lot of attention on low Earth orbit satellites back in the 1990s. If you remember Iridium and Globalstar and some companies that are still around in different forms, but there was a push then. But today we've changed. We have a lot more capability. Another piece that's interesting is what if you don't have a local ground station? Historically, for these systems to be implemented, you need a ground station around every 900 kilometers or so. But if you can't get to one easily, one of the changes that SpaceX brought with their Starlink constellation was what we sometimes call space lasers. But it's this ability to have inter-satellite linkages, laser linkages, where you can actually go from a antenna, from a user terminal on the ground, up to a low Earth orbit satellite constellation, across the constellation, and then drop down to the ground station. It means that you don't have to have as many ground stations. It also means that if a country or a region doesn't have the ability to create a ground station, they can be able to go up and across the network and back down in this kind of way. There's different speed, latency, capacity issues with this, but it is a way that it's opened up communication into areas that it was not possible to do before. At the Internet Society back in 2022, we wrote a whole paper around this, talking about some of these issues. You can get it at internetsociety.org/LEOs, and you could read about around many of the issues and the things and the points that we need to be thinking about as we all go through this. 2 years later, or actually now I guess 3 years later, we're at a different space. SpaceX has launched in this time 7,750 satellites as of yesterday. And almost 7,000 of those are working in orbit. The other ones have deorbited or other kinds of things are in motion. We've also seen a huge range of now changes in user terminals, in the devices that we use. We've got all this whole range of small things. I was at a conference actually on low Earth orbit satellites, and somebody just took out their backpack. They pulled out a Starlink Mini out of their backpack, which is over on the right side. They just set it down, plugged it in to a battery pack, and in a couple of minutes, they had full internet access for hundreds of megabits per second right there with that. This is kind of this is a little bit sci-fi in some ways as far as what we've had in the past. The ability to go and just have this kind of connectivity, be able to take it out of a backpack and be able to start working with it. It's amazing the kind of things that we're doing. We're seeing a lot of people using this for being able to go and roam or go off grid or work in some different kinds of places. In-flight connectivity has been really changed by this ability to have this high speed, low latency kind of connectivity. I mentioned the kind of resilience in terms of disasters and pieces. And then there's also a whole, and I could talk about resiliency. There's a whole area looking at how do we use this for, adjunct connectivity when a fiber cut happens. It doesn't have the capacity of a fiber cable, but it provides some ability to go and do it. And then there's this whole new realm that is being discussed of direct to cell or direct to device connectivity. And this is an interesting one because what's happened is that SpaceX in particular has partnered with some mobile operators to use their mobile frequencies to be able to transmit on from their satellites. It does require that the satellites have the connectivity, the radios, to be able to communicate on those frequencies. And it provides legal issues around being able to use it. But this is something new where you don't have to have a giant satellite phone. You could just take your regular smartphone that you may have and be able to use that with a satellite in some form. Now, this is all starting, right? It has just begun. It's just being authorized. You can do some, texting right now, but now they're starting to get to where they'll offer actual calls and pieces. And we have to see how it works because these are cell phone towers in space, right? And so if you think about how your coverage works when you go farther and farther away from a cell phone tower, now you're going really far away. So we'll have to see how this all rolls out. But there's a whole bunch of companies that are working on this. SpaceX, obviously, with their Starlink, other company called AST Space Mobile. There's a company called Link that's been actually providing the service into some parts of some Pacific Islands and others. A lot's going on. We're also seeing China launching its satellites into several different constellations. It's got about 3 different constellations it aims to rival Starlink. Now, they've just started. Their first of these, the Thousand Sails constellation, has about 50 satellites in orbit right now. So it's a long way to go to the 7,000 that's there, but it's starting to launch the pieces that are there. On a policy level, one thing that regulators have to be paying attention to is that each of these components needs some aspect of regulation. You have the satellite constellation. What's interesting here in the way it works with the International Telecommunications Union is that the licensing of the satellites and their orbits and the spectrum they use is done or initially from the country of origin. So countries like or companies like Amazon with their Project Kuiper or SpaceX with Starlink, they do all of that approval through the United States because they're based where I am here in the United States. So they do it through the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. Other constellations launching from other parts of the world do it through their local regulator. That's to get the satellites up into space. But now to use them and to work with them in each country must approve that allocation for the uplink and downlink. Each country. So all of these providers have teams that are going around and talking to each of the countries to get approval to use a spectrum in those countries. Those user terminals, whatever the devices are, have to get, consumer equipment approval. And in the ground stations, you need so-called landing rights to be able to connect down to a ground station to connect out to the rest of the internet. And this happens at different ways and different forms. Again, the operators have this. One of the reasons why we've heard OneWeb is not yet providing its service globally is because they've struggled to get the approvals to operate with ground stations in all of the countries that they would like to serve. And this is something that is one of those reasons why sometimes connectivity or Starlink is not available in some countries is these things have not yet the boxes have not been checked in different ways. The biggest deployment challenge right now is getting the satellites up there. There's only one company right now that's launching at a consistent point of view, and that's SpaceX. All the other companies that are launching have not yet launched. This was as in 2024. This is what it looked like. I think actually SpaceX had a couple of more after I set this number. Blue Origin just launched their rocket last week for the first time that was going up there. The other ones are there. So nobody is really able to go and provide this yet, which is a challenge because you only have one provider who's doing this, which comes to a long-term sustainability question that we have. Now, SpaceX is also working on their Starship. You may have seen its recent launch. When it gets going into production, it's going to carry hundreds of these satellites, goes the understanding, and it will have these larger, they're called V3 satellites, which will have more capacity, more performance, and things. Again, we'll have to see how this works. This leads to one big question about all of these, which is that all of these systems say that they only have about a 5-year lifespan. So these satellites that go up in the low Earth orbit, and part of this is atmospheric drag, it's just gravity, it's other pieces like that cause it. It only has enough propulsion to stay up there for so long. So this is a challenge that's here and a larger question. Just quickly, resilience, people are looking at how we use this in different ways. There's a lot of spectrum issues that are going on between questions and challenges of how do we best use the spectrum? Do we use it for interactions with satellites? Do we use it for 5G on the ground? There's the ITU World Radio Communications Conference, which was in 2023. It'll be coming up again in 2027. A lot of these issues will be debated. At the ITU, there's also a whole discussion around the World Telecommunications Standard Organization. There's people looking at how do we use these satellites in shutdowns. One challenge is that if a country is shut down, you can't just turn on one of these dishes. Actually, technically, you can. Legally, you can't. But there's some of these kind of challenges that are here. There's a lot of questions around space debris. Will these actually work? Or what happens when they stop working? There's a thing called a zero debris charter that people are working on. There are questions around what's happening when all of these satellites are burning up in the upper atmosphere. When we get to the point when we have tens of thousands of satellites, it's conceivable that we'll have 40 or 50 of these burning up in the upper atmosphere every single day. Is that good for the upper atmosphere? We don't know. We're all exploring these things. The astronomers of the world are rather upset. This company in particular, AST Space Mobile, its latest satellites that it's deploying are about the size, if you look at a basketball court, they're about half the size of a basketball court that would be out there. And that's huge in terms of astronomy and some of the things that we are looking at there. And they're putting hundreds of these in there. There are space weather concerns. There are, all sorts of questions. One thing that is happening is we're seeing latency, which is the amount of lag, the time it takes to get to somewhere and back, and how it goes. This is a question that we have to talk about, and then going into very low Earth orbit of what's going on there. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the other concerns around low Earth orbit, but I want to just point out, right now, we're on this track that in the next 5 years, all of these companies have said that they're going to be launching even more satellites. I mentioned Amazon's Project Kuiper will be putting up about 3,000. AST Space Mobile is the one with the giant satellites. China has about 3 satellites that'll bring about 30 to 40,000. Telesat out of Canada has a constellation called Lightspeed, and the European Union has one called Iris 2. There's conceivably hundreds of thousands of satellites that could be put up into our outer space. So lots of opportunities for connectivity. We'll have to see how this all goes, and I'm going to wait there and come back when we talk a little bit later with what we're doing. So that's the first part of what we want to say about satellites and the connectivity and where we're going.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan, for that informative presentation. All right. Thanks for sharing on how satellites are being used to fill the connectivity gap, covering some of the benefits and issues that are being faced. You mentioned something towards the end of your presentation around the debris from these satellites that are being launched. Actually, recently, there was a report that a 500 kg metal ring crashed into one of the villages in Kenya, and the villagers came around. They were fascinated, wondering what this big thing is. So, and some people were not even sure if there's radiation that is coming from this big metal ring or not. So these are some of the issues that are coming. We are trying to fill the connectivity gap, but then there are some negative effects that these they may be having on the environment. So we'll discuss later again on the impact of LEO satellites, especially in terms of what it has been for Africa, and some of the stumbling blocks that we are saying to make sure that we use LEO satellites to bridge the connectivity gap that we have in Africa, to bring the majority of the people that are still offline. Now I'm going to invite the last presenter, who is Mr. David Belson, to give us a presentation on how to measure internet of the EGAT region from Cloudflare. Welcome to the stage, and please welcome him with a round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you this morning. And I'm just south of Dan, so it is particularly cold here as well. So let me just share my screen really quickly.
Please share the presentation.
Okay, you should be able to see my screen now. So what I wanted to talk about today is, can you see it?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So what I wanted to talk about today is Cloudflare Radar, which is a tool that we've developed that helps measure internet connectivity across multiple facets. So I want to start off with a brief introduction to Cloudflare and to Cloudflare Radar, and then we'll go into a live demonstration of the tool to show you some of the different data sets and metrics that are available. So I won't spend much time on this. Basically, Cloudflare provides a number of different services, including DNS services, other application delivery services. We provide what we call edge computing or developer services, zero trust services, so these are security services, and network services. So smart routing, firewalls, denial of service attack protection, things like that. The thing to take away from this, in addition to being obviously beneficial if you're an enterprise or a developer, is that these services generate ultimately a lot of data, what I call data exhaust. And this data exhaust allows us to, properly analyzed, get a very comprehensive picture of what's happening on the internet. So we do this through a global network. We have servers deployed in over 330 cities in over 120 countries. We are extremely close, network-wise, to 95% of the world's internet-connected population. So partnering with over 13,000 networks and either deploying servers in their networks or connecting to them via peering or transit, participating in local internet exchange points, things like that. So really trying to get our systems and our network as close to end users as we can. So what is Radar? So Radar has been around for years, and Cloudflare's mission is to help build a better internet. And Radar fills that mission by exposing insights and threats and other sorts of things through aggregated data. So we're not looking at just specifically what Dan York or Steve Song are doing on the internet, looking at it at a country level or a network level. And we want to help users understand what's happening out there from a security perspective, from a performance perspective, from a user's perspective. And we do that through Cloudflare Radar, which is accessible to anybody on the internet at radar.cloudflare.com. So what can you do on Radar? This is just a general overview, and then we'll dig into a live demo. On the left there is the navigation bar. So the intent here is to just demonstrate, we have insight into traffic trends and security and attacks, internet quality, routing data, outages, things like that. You can dig in and drill down at a country level. You can also drill down at an autonomous system level. We provide historical data, so you can see trends over time. Whether that's you can select either default time periods like the last day, 2 days, 2 weeks, things like that, or if there's a specific arbitrary time period that you're interested in, you can go and select that as well. And then just a comprehensive search that's built into the site as well, where you can search for a country or a network name or network number. Or a specific term, and if we have a report, say, that's covered that term, or a specific visualization that's covered that term, that will be linked from the search results as well. So as mentioned, it's a multifaceted. It allows you to provide insights into internet connectivity and quality. I want to talk about and review 4 primary areas today. One is internet traffic, so we'll take a look at that. Connection quality, internet outages, we track those as well. Routing, so looking at how networks are interconnected. And then we also have a number of supporting capabilities within Radar. So, the ability to share graphs or embed them in your own website, signing up for notifications of certain events, a comprehensive API, and something we launched this past fall called the Data Explorer. And I want to show you a little bit about the Data Explorer, how you can use that to compare metrics between countries or compare metrics over given 2 different time frames. So if we pop over to Radar, you should see the Radar interface now. Let me just move this. So this is when you land on Cloudflare Radar. This is what you'll see. It's the overview page. If you speak a language other than English, we do have the Radar interface available in a dozen different languages. So you can select one if it's relevant. And you'll see on the left side here the different navigation opportunities or different navigation areas. So if we drill down a little bit into traffic, looking at the traffic, let me take a step back. So the radar overview page provides, as we mentioned, as you expect, an overview of different types of information that are available on radar. So we have high-level traffic trends, breakout between mobile devices and desktop devices, breakout between bot traffic, what we believe is automated traffic, and what we believe is human traffic. And then insights into different types of attacks, IPv6 adoption, HTTP version adoption, things like that, and top user agents that we see across either the world or even countries. So what we can do here is search, let's say, for Kenya. And that will bring up a list of one location found, one country, and then a list of 25 autonomous systems or networks that have Kenya within the name or within the description. So initially, let's look at it at a country level. So if we select Kenya, the page updates to show an overview of the different metrics for Kenya. It will also show the top 5 autonomous systems that we see by traffic within the country. These are not organized by traffic levels, they're randomized. We will also show the top 10 domains that we've seen from our DNS services that traffic from Kenya. So this looks, just at first glance, looks very similar to what we see in other parts of the world. And then attack breakout, IPv6 breakout at the country level, and then the user agent distribution for Kenya. So what we can see, just down here for a minute, is that the various variants of Chrome are very popular within Kenya. So if we drill down into the traffic, you'll see some very similar graphs. This is by default looking at the last 7 days, but I can drill down into, say, just the last 24 hours, or look back over the last 4 weeks. I can also select an arbitrary date range, say middle of December, but let's just leave it at this for now. So here we show traffic trends over with two different metrics. So the first is bytes. So looking at the trends over the last week, with bytes delivered to Kenya from Cloudflare. The next is HTTP requests. So the curves should look fairly similar here. So we're seeing request traffic, both request traffic and bytes traffic are showing, very clear diurnal, fairly consistent diurnal patterns, which largely indicates, I think, that things are relatively normal. In terms of no disruptions, no real anomalies. The page also shows insight into mobile versus desktop breakdown. Obviously, this is something where if a mobile network provider had an outage or mobile network were shut down for some reason, we would see the percentage of shift here. Generally, then in that case, we would see a greater percentage of desktop traffic, obviously. We see bot versus human breakout. So, Cloudflare classifies each request we get as, is it coming from something automated or is it coming from, a human? So here we're seeing that about 3/4 of the traffic we see in Kenya is human, or we believe it to be coming from humans. We can also drill down very similarly at an autonomous system level. So let's say we look at Safaricom here. You can see that the traffic patterns are relatively similar, very clear diurnal patterns, some interesting spikes though within the graphs. And the other thing I'll point out too is that we also show with the dotted lines the traffic patterns for the previous 7 days. So here we can kind of do a quick comparison and say, on say Friday, traffic was more or less where we'd expect it to be. It hewed very closely to the previous week's lines, but on Thursday here, Thursday evening UTC, we can see that bytes traffic was much higher than the previous week. So that's sort of interesting and unclear what caused that. We can see that the request traffic was a little bit higher as well. And again, the similar breakouts, with respect to the mobile versus desktop, bots versus human. We can also look at internet quality. So Cloudflare is gathering this data from 2 different sources. One is a set of tests that run in the background when a user reaches an error page. The other is a speed.cloudflare.com tool that users can go to. So if you're familiar with say, the UCLA speed test or MLab, Measurement Lab, these are very similar tools. And we can gather this data, we aggregate it here. So we can show for Safaricom, for instance, the expected band of connection speed, so download speed here, and then what the median is. So here we're seeing Safaricom, we're measuring a median download speed of about 9 megabits and how it's trending over the course of the last week. We see latency here, pretty consistent patterns in latency. And then we also can look at sort of in aggregate, what sort of speed, the speed tests, how are those clustering? So we're seeing here, most of the speed tests are clustering, under 100 megabits. And then it trails off, pretty significantly from there. If we were to look at Kenya as a country, we can see, as soon as this loads, that the median connection speed here, again, is about 9 megabits. The bands are a little bit wider, the 75th and 25th percentile bands. Median latency is very similar as well. And then if we look at the clustering of the connection speeds, we can see that at least from a bandwidth perspective, both upload and download, it's good to see actually that the graphs are fairly mirror image. That means there's a lot of the service in Kenya has similar upload and download speeds, and that it again trails off very quickly after 100 megabits. So you can use this to try to understand what Cloudflare sees from a network quality perspective for a given country or a given network provider. We also have an outage center. So there's 2 pieces that I'll show you on the outage center. The first is traffic anomalies. This is the bottom of the page here. And this is where we have a set of tools that run traffic analysis in an automated fashion. And when we see traffic drop below a certain expected level, we'll fire off an automated alert, and basically say, hey, there was a traffic anomaly observed in this particular case, say Chad, last Friday evening. And then we can go and investigate and understand, was that something where it shows up in other data sources? So we sort of verify, yes, that's a legitimate observation. Or, if we say, look, we looked around and couldn't find justification or corroboration in other data sources, it's more likely an anomaly. So in that case, it wouldn't be verified. And then in some cases, what we'll do is we'll actually declare some of these as actual outages. If we were able to identify a particular cause for a given observed anomaly. So here, if I open the data set to the last 12 months, you can see on the map above the clusters of outages and anomalies. Here's Africa. We can see a number of them across Africa. You can see how they cluster from a time perspective. And then again here, if we wanted to, for example, search for those that we've seen in Kenya, that will filter the list. So we can see that there was a number of them that were caused by power outages in the country back in December, September, August, and May. And then several that were in June and May, also reportedly caused by cable cuts. So you can take a look here, and then there's a link to the outage within the traffic page itself. You can sign up for notifications or a link to more information. And generally, that's going to link to either a social media post or a blog post, in some cases, a news article. If we bring this back to the last 7 days, and then we can go and close out with a look at routing. So let's refilter this. And then again, let's look at Kenya. So you can look at this either at a country level or a network level. And we provide some information here about routing statistics, especially RPKI, which I think could arguably be a whole session unto itself. The amount of address space announced by networks, either in the given country or if this is a network view by that network provider. And then at a country level, looking at the autonomous systems that are present within the country. So again, let's pick on Safaricom because the routing data is arguably more interesting at that level. So we can look at Safaricom announces 90 IP address prefixes, and all of them are RPKI valid. So actually, that's worth a round of applause. That is fantastic from a routing security perspective. At a network level, we can look at the announced IP address space. So
in 2 minutes. Okay.
Okay. So we are Safaricom is very stable here. And then what I wanted to really point out here, though, is the insight we also have in terms of the interconnections between network providers. So this is really important, something to look at, where if you look at, say, for Safaricom, their upstream providers are by and large US based. Half of them are US based, and then there are a handful of EMEA providers there as well. They peer with, let's take a look here. And their peers are also, I think, fairly limited from a local perspective. So obviously, a network provider that has a richer local interconnection, we'll see a list there. You'll be able to see that they have more peers and more upstream providers in that given region. And then the last thing I wanted to just highlight, let's go back to traffic for a minute. And then we can also look at traffic within the Data Explorer. So if we click into the Data Explorer tool from a radar graph, what we're able to see here, basically this is a detailed interface into our API. So if we wanted to say, for instance, compare this to so let's say we wanted to look at Safaricom traffic and compare it to Kenya as a whole. We can do that here. We can see that obviously, as you'd expect, the aggregate traffic from Kenya is much higher than the aggregate traffic from the network itself. You can also break it out into different metrics as well. So we can compare, say, bandwidth at a country level and a network level. So here it's a little bit busy, but you can also, or you can say, you want to compare between Uganda and Kenya. You can do that here as well. So ultimately, to wrap up, the radar tool is available to anybody on the internet. And as I mentioned, we have the rich API. You can sign up for notifications, and any of those graphs that I demonstrated, you can share or embed on your own blogs or websites or what have you. So thank you for the time today.
Thank you very much, David, for the demonstration on how to use. Thank you very much for demonstrating how to use Cloudflare Radar to monitor could be to monitor the quality of service or to monitor security attacks on our networks or to understand the network traffic or any other functionalities. So thank you very much for that. I'm just gonna check if people are alert in the room. Okay, yeah, people are awake. Anyone who has used Cloudflare Radar before? Okay, I see one hand. Anyone who is
Okay, that's
aware
a good
of the
start.
Open Fiber standard? Okay, that's good. All right, so we're going to move into the next part of our session, which is a brief panel discussion with our three presenters. I'm glad I can see all of them online. In that case, I don't feel so alone upstage. I have three other people with me. So welcome again to our three panelists. So we'll continue our discussion in terms of how do we bring Africa's connectivity to the next level. So far from the presentation, we've kind of understood what we can use to understand the status of connectivity through the use of infrastructure maps and how innovative technologies such as LEO satellites are being used to fill connectivity gaps in Africa and across the globe. And then lastly, we just had a demonstration of how to use tools like Cloudflare Radar to measure internet performance. So I think, and I hope you found that very useful to the work that you do. And also, how do we also come together to help people who are not in this room to make sure that they're also connected or they're brought online. I'm going to start with Steve when it comes to the panel discussion. My first question is, just building on what you've said so far, what innovative approaches or partnerships would you recommend to effectively address connectivity challenges, especially to underserved and unserved communities in African countries that can be considered? So over to you.
Thank you. I think that the one point I would like to emphasize is diversity in ownership of network infrastructure, and I think that not only is diversity in ownership of network infrastructure good for competition and good as a kind of safety check, but it also opens up opportunities for new actors in the access space. So, for instance, municipalities already invest significantly in infrastructure such as waste collection or street maintenance or a variety of services to their citizens. Many of those involve digging in the ground, putting up poles, whether it's utilities or other things. And investing in fiber infrastructure is a great strategy for a municipality. And that can improve their negotiating power in terms of attracting operators to their city and also helping citizens get affordable access. But they can only do it effectively when they understand where the upstream connectivity is and what the opportunities are. So, for instance, if you were a city or a town of 20,000 people and you knew that the nearest point of presence on a fiber optic network was 20 kilometers away, well, immediately there may be a business case for you as a city, as a town, to invest in connecting, in building a connection to to that point of presence. And I think so different kinds of organizations, not just commercial operators, but government structures, whether it's national, state level, or at town level, can own infrastructure. And other kinds of organizations, ranging from cooperatives to nonprofits, can also own infrastructure. And by having more transparency in the sector around fiber optic infrastructure, I think we can unlock those possibilities and create a more egalitarian environment as well, reducing dependency on either a single or a few operators for network infrastructure, and ultimately increasing resiliency.
Sorry for the silence, Steve. Technical issues here on my end. Thank you very much for that response. I'll now move to Dan, if you can come up screen. So you have already demonstrated that. Dan, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, perfect. So in your presentation, you already demonstrated that LEO satellites such as Starlink are already getting a lot of attention, and increasingly being used to bring connectivity across Africa, to connect communities that are still unconnected. And you've also talked about some of the technical and policy elements of LEO systems, but what are the main challenges that you see to deployment and usage of LEO satellites? And also looking at the horizon, what does it look like for LEO systems, and what should policymakers and regulators and stakeholders be aware of or be prepared for? Over to you.
Sure. So let me just maybe take a quick look and see. This is the current map of Starlink in Africa, and where it's available, and the kind of pieces there. You've asked those good questions. What are the challenges? Some of that is obviously the deployment, but on a local level, a big one is affordability, right? These services are expensive, but you have to pay for the kit, the Starlink terminal and the piece that's there. You also then have a monthly subscription fee and the pieces that are there. Now, we are seeing different kinds of options. We're seeing some places doing direct subsidy of things. Here's a place, the state of Maine, which is part of the United States, where they're buying Starlink dishes for 9,000 people that are around there. You're seeing in Kenya that there's a model now where you can rent the Starlink kits to be able to go and have it. So you're seeing some models like that. But you're also seeing a lot of disruption, that's happening through there. There was a recent article in the Rest of World that talked about how Starlink is now cheaper in a number of different countries as compared to terrestrial providers, which creates a lot of disruption, right? Because now the regular ISPs are finding themselves in intense competition against a provider that is a global entity that is coming in and offering prices that are substantially cheaper in some countries than in others. Now, on the other hand, you're seeing some business models that are working. This is an example out of Nigeria, where what they were doing was using Starlink as the backhaul for the local cellular network, and being able to provide that kind of connectivity in some form. You're seeing a lot of changes too, that people are looking at licensing fees. We just saw this in Kenya, where they're changing around the license fee on how to go and what can be used inside of there. Some of the challenges that you look at to fill out that map is the concerns around competition with terrestrial operators. How do you go and do that? In some countries, in parts of Africa and other parts, there are requirements around how much must there be local economic participation, some percentage of access provided by local providers or others, which is a good idea. But the challenge is that these global providers like Starlink or some of these other ones, they're global entities. They don't have a local connection. They're not doing that. There's certainly concerns around the economic flow of the dollars out to global corporations, security monitoring concerns. Another one is that typically, as we look at this direct to cell spot, something to be thinking about is the fact that many of these systems, only work with one network operator. So the Starlink will work with somebody in some market. So they're choosing the people who will have that. And so there's this real lack of competition. And then, as we said, there is this unproven long-term business model. All of these systems are starting, but really Starlink only started operating, providing internet access in 2020, 2021. So we're just in that first stage of things, and it's just expanding and just beginning in countries across Africa and other parts. We don't know how this is going to work in the long term. It has this opportunity to provide real life-changing connectivity in many ways, but we don't know where that will be in 5, 6, 7 years. I think there's some opportunities to look at how do you use it for connecting the rural and underserved communities. But, what is it? Is it subsidies? Is it rental? Is it some people like that? I think one of the interesting things for people to think about in parts is how can you use Starlink to get that connectivity rapidly into some of the communities, help people learn digital skills, helping people learn how to use the connectivity, how to work online, how to create their businesses doing that. And then looking at how you also get them, the higher speed, lower latency of fiber. As Steve mentioned earlier, there's some great opportunities for fiber and rollout. And what's interesting is in the ideal world, fiber can be your best connectivity. It has the lowest latency, the highest speed in both directions, both upload and download. And it can be the most resilient subject to physical world kind of issues, but it can provide the kind of connectivity that's there. That's really the standard. But can Starlink be a way to get that connectivity quickly, get people interested online using it, and provide a business model then for rolling that fiber out even more? Resilience is a key part, and there's two elements. LEOs can offer tremendous resilience for that return to connectivity after extreme weather events, whether it's flooding, whether it's whatever it may be. And it can provide resilience in terms of cable cuts, all of that to a certain degree. Fiber also provides resilience for that long-term connectivity because we don't know where this is all going in some way. So I think those are just some thoughts I would share around that as far as how we go and work with that. I want to just reemphasize something Steve said, though. I think one of the key parts is this idea of community-centered connectivity, of looking at how do we enable communities to go and truly create their connectivity and connect their network and connect it back to the rest of the internet. Because that, when you have connectivity that is created by the people in the community for the community, that is really how you bring the communities online around the world. So back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. If we can stay on screen for just a bit, you just mentioned a very interesting point on the disruption that Starlink has brought into the different markets, especially the point where you mentioned that is now cheaper. The services provided by Starlink are cheaper than those of the local operators, which has made me wonder, does it mean that consumers were being charged all along by the local operators? Or what informs the pricing for Starlink? Is it sustainable even into the future? So what does this really mean for local operators, and how can they evolve so that they can survive this disruption? Over to you.
It's a great question, and it I think there's a variety of factors that come into play around how things are priced in different areas. But Starlink, one of the things about the LEO constellation market is once you get a constellation up there, it's there. You don't have to deploy any more lines. You don't have to do anything else. It's just there. It's available. It's available everywhere on the globe. So there's no additional cost for them to go and bring in. They don't have to run more wires. They don't have to run anything. They just have to get Starlink kits out to people. They have to get that, and they have to get the regulatory approvals. That's actually the biggest barrier, is getting those approvals that are there. So their cost, once they've gone through the rather enormous cost of launching, thousands upon thousands of satellites up into space, once they've done that, then they can go around with a pricing model that they can go and change. And they are doing market-based pricing, where in some countries it will be less than it is in others. They have this global capacity. There are over 4 million, subscribers right now, according to their numbers. We don't have independent analysis, but they're saying that. And we're, so for them, they can go into markets and they can be able to go and do this. It's the same for all of the other LEO constellations that are coming along. OneWeb, Project Kuiper, the Chinese systems that are out there, all the different ones that are coming online. Once you got it up there, compare that to terrestrial ISPs where you have to be laying the fiber, you have to be building the cell towers, you have to do that. Your additive costs continue to be to reach more regions. There's a cost there. So the cost models are very different. Now, again, you get into capacity issues. Like in Kenya, for instance, they paused subscriptions into Starlink in some areas because they have too many people wanting to subscribe, and there's a limit to the number of people within a certain region that can all be interacting with the satellites. So there's a certain piece around that. Now, Starlink's answer, of course, is to send up more satellites and bigger satellites that can handle more capacity, bigger pipes, basically, in space. And they're going to continue to do that. And so over time, they'll be able to go and do more of that. But that will be the gating factor that comes into there. But that's kind of what a traditional ISP is up against, is that a company can go and do this. It's a challenge. It's a competitive challenge. There's no way to get around that. And I think the key for the local service providers will be, can they provide competitive products? Can they provide a better, faster fiber connection? Can they go and do that? Because fiber does have a faster upload and download speed. Fiber has a stronger, connections in those things. So that's one aspect that they can do with. Some local ISPs, I'm sure, will look to go and partner with Starlink and the other providers for direct to sell, and that's another way to be involved in some way. I think there's some longer term questions. We haven't seen that. That hasn't rolled out yet. It's just rolling out in the United States right now. So we'll have to see how that actually works. But it's going to be it is a competitive challenge. I see Steve raise his hand, so I know he's got some opinions on this too.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that clarification. And lastly, I'm going to invite David up screen. You already demonstrated. Are you there, David?
I'm here. Yep.
All right, perfect. Okay, yeah. Earlier on, you demonstrated how Cloudflare radar is a valuable resource for tracking internet trends and performance. Can you briefly explain how you gathered the data that appears on the radar and how it can help identify bottlenecks for connectivity for data-driven decision making for maybe operators or governments globally?
Yep, absolutely. So as I had briefly mentioned, most of the data that appears on radar is what I would call data exhaust. So by virtue of providing the services that we do for millions of websites and hundreds, thousands of enterprises, effectively each request, whether it's a regular content request or a denial of service attack request or things like that, generates a log line. And, in aggregate, we can, aggregate those log lines by country or by network or whatever, do the analysis on them. And then that's where the traffic trends come from. That's where the insights into what type of device it is or what the user agent was, that all comes from the analysis of the data that's generated by delivery of our services. The routing data that I showed, that is actually based on data feeds from RIPE, the European Internet Registry, as well as the Route Views organization. And then in terms of identifying bottlenecks, I think you can think of bottlenecks in several different ways. So you can use radar to identify networks or countries where connectivity is less stable. So we talked about the traffic anomalies or the outages that we identify. So you can find those insights in radar. You can identify networks or countries that have poor connection quality. So we talked about the connection quality page, looking at upload speed, download speeds, latency and packet loss. And that especially, those measurements all become important too when you start drilling down on use case scenario. So if you're talking about live streaming or video conferencing or gaming, each of those have a slightly different set of requirements to provide a high quality experience. So the radar data can help provide insights there. And then I think finally, you can think of obviously routing as a bottleneck. And as Dan and Steve have talked about, routing is a key piece of resilience. So if a given network provider, or so let me take a step back. Some countries have only one or two network providers that act as a gateway to the rest of the internet. So obviously those can become potential bottlenecks. And I think then the lack of local connectivity as well can also become problematic and become a bottleneck as well. So thinking back to the slide that Steve presented looking at say all those networks that were coming into Rio de Janeiro. It's great that you've got multiple network providers in one of the biggest cities in the country, but if none of them are interconnected with each other, that's going to be a bottleneck. You're going to have to hairpin the traffic from Rio de Janeiro, say up to Miami, and then back to exchange traffic between two network providers that probably have offices in the same building. So the radar data, the routing data that we present can also help identify bottlenecks in that respect.
Great. Thanks, David. That's very useful. I just want to check the room and see if we have any questions. I know I have another round of questions for the panelists, but I think the audience has been quiet for quite some time, so they may have some questions or they may have some additions. All right. Okay. Oh, okay. Please go ahead. There's a mic behind you.
Thank you. My name is Alfred Kitahi from Kenya. I'm a network engineer and an entrepreneur. Had a question for both Steve and Dan. You spoke about the open data standard, and I think that's a really exciting initiative. And I agree that it would be really exciting if all ISPs would adopt this. And you also talked about the hesitation from competitors and various operators to publish their data. So I'm curious to know what environmental factors have allowed ISPs like Unity in the US to be comfortable to share their network data in this open standard. Because if we knew what environmental factors influenced that decision, maybe we could try and replicate the same in our markets here. My other question is similar again, but now on the LEO satellite conversation. I think this goes to Dan. Again, what environmental factors have allowed Starlink to proliferate? And a question: do you think that that African governments, in the same way African governments have co-invested when it comes to terrestrial fiber and allowing it to penetrate into underserved areas. Now we have this new technology of low Earth orbit satellites. Do you think African governments should co-invest as well in the low Earth orbit satellite space as a way of improving access and affordability? Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Thank you for that. There is another hand at the back. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm João Aguiar. I'm actually a colleague of both Dan and Steve. And I have a question for both of them, actually. So, Steve, you talked a little bit about community-centered connectivity in your presentation. I remember it was a little bit over a year ago, you wrote a very good article about Starlink and inequality. And one of the things that you mentioned was that the fact that Starlink was providing internet to rural areas would actually end up discouraging operators to put up fiber or terrestrial infrastructure. So I know that you shared a little bit of recommendations already, but what would you recommend for operators and governments to keep in mind when investing, for instance, in supporting Starlink or LEO satellite systems?
Right. Thank you again for the question. We have another hand. I hope my panelists are keeping note of the questions. We have 3 questions so far.
Thank you. I'm David Bakkala, Internet Society. Thank you, the 3 of you, for your excellent presentations. My question is around LEO, and especially for the IGAD region that is the scope of this conference. I don't know if you have mentioned that, Dan, but I don't know if there is any country in the IGAD region who has allowed the use of Starlink or any other LEO satellite system. I don't know if in Kenya it's accepted. Probably it's the only country in IGAD where that is possible. So I guess they have mainly 2 concerns, and I wish that there were some regulators here, but I think what I have heard is the first one is security. They say it's outside of our control, so we cannot allow that to happen. The second one is a push from the mobile operators that think it is an unfair competition. So what do you say about that? Is it really something that can really live with the existing operators, or is it really an unfair competition to the mobile operators? Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone for the questions. Yeah, Steve, there's a few questions that are targeted for you. Do you want to take them?
Sure, thank you. To address the first question about, why do companies like Unity in the US or Dark Fiber Africa in South Africa share the information about their networks and others don't? I think there are 2 things. One is it's a kind of mindset in that a network map like Dark Fiber Africa's map is fantastic marketing and advertising, right? It demonstrates the breadth of the network infrastructure. So getting fiber operators to see that from the point of view of sharing network maps and more detailed network maps as an advertising mechanism. I know Airtel in India, they share a network map of their towers infrastructure, and they call it the open network, and their slogan is because we have nothing to hide. So, changing that mindset to looking at sharing that information as great marketing is one side, but also allaying concerns about that sort of sharing would undermine their competitiveness locally, and so by having a common standard for sharing, I think that can address that issue. And then on to Starlink, a couple of points. One is that I think network ownership matters in the long term. If you own the network, there is a whole ecosystem that comes along with it. So, for instance, when we look at fiber infrastructure, we don't just get fiber networks. We get companies that are experts in building and trenching equipment. In many African countries, we have companies that are manufacturing fiber for rollout. There are network engineers at every level who are developing and growing expertise at the building and management and deployment of those networks. My concern about LEO constellations is much of that kind of complementary local economy that comes with a network that you own is being excluded. The second point I would like to make about Starlink is really about the difference between wholesale and retail networks. the danger I see in remote communities where the wealthiest people in a community may be able to afford a Starlink community, and that solves their problem, but it doesn't solve access for the rest of the community, and may in fact take pressure off those comparatively wealthy people who might otherwise be a squeaky wheel saying, why haven't you rolled out fiber to my community? Well, their problem is solved. And so the danger there of kind of increasing inequity and inequality by making high-speed internet access accessible to those who can afford it is, I think, a worrisome trend. I do like, though, the idea of LEO constellations as wholesale services that can serve operators like Dan pointed to Africa Mobile Networks, where Starlink is being used by backhaul for backhaul. And Africa Mobile Networks are serving the entire community, not just one or two people in those communities. So those are the 2 points I would make about Starlink. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Again, very useful as always. I think the other question, maybe Dan, do you have anything to add on the LEO satellites?
Oh yeah, no, I could talk about a lot of that for a bit. My apologies, I had some construction happening. I want to come back to, I think Steve's made excellent points on all of this as far as the value of network ownership and also the need for diversity. One of the challenges we're seeing is that a lot of these networks are being built by billionaires. You have Elon Musk with SpaceX and this, you have Amazon's Project Kuiper. OneWeb was already built and it's up there, and then it was acquired by Eutelsat after some bankruptcies and pieces that are there. And this comes to the point that the gentleman asked about the question of, what have other governments done to allow this, and the co-investing question. What have other governments done to allow this? Well, in some ways, they've allowed they've set up the regulatory environment that allows the spectrum to be allocated. They've let the consumer equipment in. They've opened up the landing station. They've gone through that process. That's everywhere that Starlink is turned on. They've done those three things. They've approved the consumer equipment, they've approved the spectrum allocation, and they've done this. Now, I'll mention in some countries there are some technical issues. I was in Armenia, or I was speaking to an event in Armenia, and one of the issues that they had was that they actually use some of the same frequencies that Starlink needs to communicate. Just they use them in their military, in their intelligence systems and stuff. And so they couldn't actually technically allow Starlink to come in because of the fact that there'd be the sharing with the other communications. They would have to actually go through the process of moving their government communication off to be able to work with it. So in some cases, there may actually be technical issues, but in a lot of cases, it's the approvals that are there. Now, to the co-investing question, I've been in some of these where people said, well, can we build our own LEO system? In the days of geosynchronous satellites, some countries have done that, right? They built their own satellite, which then they've launched. They've parked it way out in geosynchronous orbit. It's right over their country and able to provide geostationary connectivity. That's great because you're building one satellite. It costs a whole lot, but you get it up there, you do it, you're done. With LEOs, you've got to deploy hundreds to thousands of satellites, and you've got to keep on launching them and building them because you've got to replace them every 5 years. So the scale that you need is massive. What you're seeing corporate interests do this, both in the US and others, and in China, that's a number of different companies and government entities that are doing it. In the EU, you've seen they've come together to go and create what they're calling IRIS or IRIS2, which is a network that will be a European government, an EU-owned entity, which will do that. There's space that, when you talk about co-investing, if governments across Africa, across different parts of the world were to come together and look at how do we build another satellite constellation that could do that, there's a space there that somebody could do it. You would need kind of global cooperation to go and make it happen, though, because the satellites aren't just over your country or your region, they're over the rest of the world. And it will take billions of dollars to make it happen. That's the challenge, is you can't just go and build something that works over your country. It works over the world, and the economic business models aren't there for, a country to do it alone. It would have to be something done by a global, corporation or a collection of governments that worked together around the world to provide that kind of thing. Dawit, you asked the question about the push by local mobile operators. We've seen this all around the world. There's a competitive aspect where mobile operators push back, fight back because they don't want the competition coming in. You saw that chart I put up. In many cases, in some countries, Starlink winds up being less expensive than the best plan from the local ISPs. From a competitive point of view, this is what happens. Here in the United States, Starlink and Project Kuiper have to get their approvals through the United States Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. When the FCC goes and says we're going to be able to go and do this, every time all of the mobile operators and some of the geostationary satellite providers provide filings saying you can't allow Starlink to do this. You can't allow SpaceX to do this. It's wrong. It's bad. And they'll provide any number of reasons why it goes. So this is happening all around the world. Is that mobile operators are pushing back because they don't want the competition, and I understand it. So the challenge is, for all the reasons Steve mentioned, it's excellent to have networks that are owned and operated by people in the country doing this and that kind of thing. It's not really feasible economically to do that with a low Earth orbit constellation. And so those LEO constellations are going to be owned by large players and pieces like that who don't have the same economic incentive to work with that. So the question for many countries is, do you want the low latency, high speed connectivity that you can get from LEOs? What are you willing to trade off to get that? Do you want that now? Or will you build out your infrastructure locally and not have that while other countries in the area are getting it? That's really the ultimate question. And there's no other easy way to say that, because this is the competition in the market that we're in that kind of way. I think there are very good reasons why you need to continue to look at how do we build out local terrestrial infrastructure, how do we build more community networks, how do we build more local ownership, how do we build that mesh of interconnected terrestrial networks. But there's also the lure of, here's this high speed, low latency connectivity that we can get from space for a cost.
Great. Thank you, Dan, for those insights. I think all the questions have been covered. I'm just going to check again if we have any additional questions before we wrap up. Okay, we have 2 more questions. My panelists, please be prepared. Can we have the roaming mic?
Thank you again. This is Alfred again. I forgot to ask this question. You mentioned about SpaceX and the number of satellites that of birds they have in the air now being over 7,000, and their global rollout, which has been quite impressive. However, this raises questions and concerns about considering just how much of a head start they have compared to other companies that are launching low Earth orbit satellites. There are concerns about them being the first mover, monopolizing the spectrum, which is a limited resource. So, how would you advise? So yes, for example, in Kenya, it's been allowed to operate, but even if another player came, they've already monopolized the spectrum already. So, how can you advise us here in Africa, from an IGOT perspective, to protect this limited resource, which is spectrum, that one player is currently monopolizing? By the time AST and whoever else comes, the spectrum that will already have been allocated to one player, which is a concern. Would be glad to hear your thoughts.
Sure.
Thanks for that question. Let's take the last question, then you can respond.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ababa Bakala. I just want to ask about policy frameworks and regulatory measures. Which can, do you have any propose, what you propose so as to, like Ethiopian, like a country Ethiopian, if it applies regulatory frameworks and policy frameworks and regulatory measures that can help the Ethiopian government or other countries like Ethiopia to fasten and implement for the utilization of LEO? Thank you.
Right. Thanks for those two questions. I think there's Dan. Do you want to take the two questions?
Sure. And then I would also welcome David if you want to chime in on it here. So the first one about spectrum sharing, well, so and the space. It all comes back to, the biggest thing it comes back to is this barrier, the choke point on launch, on getting satellites up there. If we go back a few years, Amazon actually they did something amazing, which was they went around and made the biggest amount of contracting for launch services that had ever been done in the history of the planet. They went out and they signed 83 or so contracts with launch providers to go and launch their Project Kuiper satellites. They signed them with United Launch Alliance, with Arianespace, with Blue Origin. This was a couple of years ago. Their plan was to get all of their satellites in orbit by now, really. There was the original plan and pieces like that. The challenge is none of those other launch providers are launching. They're all caught in the process of moving to new satellites, new rockets. Arianespace is moving to the Ariane 6. ULA is moving to Vulcan Centaur. Blue Origin is just launching its first rocket that will get into orbit. And so we have this barrier where SpaceX is the only company launching satellites. There's a few others, Japan's space agency, India's space agency, they're launching a few. But Starlink, SpaceX, is launching 3 to 4 rockets a week, providing payloads up into space. And that's the huge thing that has enabled them to do this, because they control the launch capacity to be able to go and do that. Until we have competition in the launch space, and there's a whole load of providers trying to do this, but until we get that competition, that's one of the big barriers to getting more of these to have competition in the launch space. Now, SpaceX is glad to launch other people's satellites. So they're actually going to launch some of Project Kuiper satellites. They've launched some of OneWeb satellites. They'll launch anybody's satellites. But to provide satellites at the scale, you've really got to have more and more of these launching and this kind of system that's there. So that's kind of the big barrier. When it comes to spectrum and the piece of there, one of the things that's happened here in the United States and other places is there is a degree of spectrum sharing. And that's, I think, the key, is to make sure that these systems can, when they're being allowed to do it, can you share the frequencies? There's some limited bands that are used for the KU and the bands that are used for the spectrum for uplink and downlink. Can those be shared? That's really the key question, to make sure that you can do it, because there are all of these people who are working in these different systems. Now, some of the direct-to-cell systems like AST Space Mobile, they get into an interesting aspect where they're using, and this is also SpaceX with their direct-to-cell, they're using the same frequencies already allocated to one of the mobile operators. So for instance, here in the United States, where they've partnered with T-Mobile from Starlink, they're using T-Mobile's frequencies to be able to communicate, so that your T-Mobile phone would be able to go and connect directly using the same frequencies that are already in the phone. So that's how they do some of this direct to phone, direct to device, direct to cell connectivity, is they're using the spectrum already allocated to the mobile operator. But the big advice would be, look at how you ensure that the spectrum can be shared or used in some way and form, because yes, there's a whole load of competitors and we want that kind of competition that's out there. To the second question on the regulatory frameworks and pieces there, this is also new, to be honest, that we don't yet really have clear advice or clear, things. Again, I would do whatever I can to encourage competition, to ensure that the spectrum can be shared, to look at how it can be used to encourage competition. We don't want to just have monopolies in space, which is what we do have right now, but we don't want that to continue long term. We want to ensure that there are competitive spaces that people are able to work in there in some form. I hope that answered.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. I feel like you've already got a lot of questions from the audience, and I'm thinking of saving you from the second round of questions. So I'm going to ask the three of you to individually give your final views or contributions. What do you want the people in this room to take away, and any recommendations that you have for the EGAT countries to focus on to improve connectivity in the region? All right, I will start with, I'm going to start with David. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think as far as a takeaway, I would encourage the attendees to use Cloudflare Radar to exercise the tool and to see what it has to show you. Please feel free to reach out. I'm Belson, DBELSON @cloudflare.com. If you have any questions, or there's data that you are not seeing there, or questions on how to use it, please reach out to me. In terms of what can be done to continue to improve connectivity, I think a lot of it rides on what Dan and Steve were talking about in terms of just providing more access to more people in more places. I think that from my perspective, so doing some of that will then naturally bring better speeds, more resilience, lower latency, so better connection quality, and then with better resilience also comes fewer traffic anomalies, fewer outages. But I would also encourage the local policymakers to avoid implementing internet shutdowns. That's something I follow very closely. So consider, if you have some sort of like a social issue, look for another approach rather than a technical approach of just broadly shutting down the internet or broadly shutting down a mobile network provider. So yeah, I'd say just I think part of it is investment, but part of it is policy to ensure an open internet and an internet that's available to all citizens.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Steve, any final reflections?
Steve had to step away for a medical appointment.
Steve had to step away, but if I could say what he would say, I think in terms of he would encourage people to look at how can we use this open fiber data standard to look at how do we build terrestrial maps or maps of terrestrial infrastructure. As he mentioned in his presentation, we've got some excellent maps of undersea cables and pieces like that, but we don't understand the terrestrial fiber. So the request to all of you, certainly for the EGAD region, but across into all of Africa, is can local network operators help make their infrastructure understandable? Because that helps us, especially from a resilience point of view. Can we get a picture of what does the infrastructure look like? That allows us, when there's things like cable cuts in the seacoast, we can look at the maps and be able to understand where can connectivity route, where can things go. So I would encourage people to look at, or Steve would encourage people to look at OFDS and look at how can they use that to make information about their data structure or their infrastructure available as data that people can use. If he were here, I think he would say that, and he would also encourage people to look at diversity of network ownership and really look at how do we ensure that we have a competitive environment for connectivity that includes lots of different players and opportunities for innovation and for people that would be there. So that'd be Steve, I think.
Yeah,
from my end,
great, thank you. Now your turn.
From my end, I would just say, from the topic I was talking about here, low Earth orbit satellites are really kind of, they can be a life-changing thing. They bring connectivity to remote and underserved regions that is just amazing. People can participate in our online world. They can not only do things like, stream movies or do things in education. They can also create and upload in ways they couldn't before. So part of the power of bringing this kind of high-speed, low-latency connectivity is that people in the region can create They can, be the next creator on a social network. They can go and provide information for their business. They can do it. It can really change. This kind of connectivity can change lives in so many ways. And the second part of that would be resilience is so critical. You've mentioned it. It was a topic before. And I was at a workshop in Washington, D.C. last month about internet resilience and looking at all of these different factors. Satellites are part of that picture, but it's also important to think about, they are new. We're in the beginning stages of using them, even with all the marketing and everything that we see all over the space. It's new. We're still getting there. It's just going off the ground. It's just really happening over the last 4 or 5 years. So it's a lot of unknowns. We don't know the long-term sustainability. Are companies really going to be able to keep on launching and replacing the satellites all the time? What are the impacts to our planet and to the climate for all of these things burning up in the upper atmosphere and the rockets that are continually launching? We don't know these questions. We don't know how strong these will all survive extreme space weather. We don't know that. So they're awesome. They can provide excellent connectivity and are a super great tool to have in our toolbox. But we have to think of them as one of the many paths we have, and think about how we are also building resilience should something happen to that as well. So I think I would say that. And the key point that Steve mentioned, I think, is we at the Internet Society believe that the internet is for everyone and it needs to get to everyone. And we need to bring everyone online, not only just so that they get the opportunities of the internet, but that we get the opportunities of learning from the people who are just getting connected. It's a two-way piece around that. And so we need to unlock that potential and really bring the internet to everyone in so many ways. So thank you all for what you're doing there at the conference in Addis. And I hope you have a great rest of the time at the event. Thank you very much for having me here.
Right. Thank you very much, Dan, and thanks to the three of you for sharing so passionately in terms of how we can improve connectivity in Africa and across the globe. I know some of you had to wake up super early to join this session. Some of you had to wake up at 6 in the morning, or actually join at 7 in the morning to share those great insights. So we really appreciate that, and I hope everyone in this room feels even more energized to go back to our respective workplaces, to continue doing what we do best, or even do more to bring the majority of the people who are still offline online in the best possible way in the very near future. So thanks everyone again for being attentive throughout the session, for your comments, for the questions that you have shared with us. So thank you very much. I appreciate all of you. All right.
Mashingo, just stay for a few seconds for a picture. It's unfortunate that the speakers are not here, but you are with us spiritually. And unfortunately, we had